For today's session, despite it being a holiday. And today we are going to talk about a topic that is much discussed in Sri Lanka, corruption. And we have invited Dr.Ermal Frasheri to talk to us about corruption during times of political upheaval. He's a professor, he's an adjunct professor at Stern College of Law, Denver University, who actually teaches a course on law and corruption. So we invited him because to give us a different perspective of corruption, to broaden our understanding and deepen our understanding of corruption by providing a more historical, theoretical, and a comparative perspective of corruption, its causes, its evolution, and the remedies. Because corruption is not a unique problem faced by Sri Lanka. Many countries across the world, just like Sri Lanka, struggles with corruption and how to tackle corruption. And only a very few countries in the world have successfully tackled corruption to a level where it is not a major inhibitor of growth and prosperity of the country and the well-being of its people. And corruption is also not a unique problem faced by modern societies. It is a century-old problem. So there is much we can learn from history, from other countries, the experiences about corruption. And that is exactly why we invited Dr.Ermal Frasheri. And Ermal is not a stranger to Sri Lanka. He has worked in Sri Lanka for about 2 years, from 2016 to 2018. Assisting the government in formulating trade and investment policies. He's a senior fellow at the Growth Lab, Center for International Development at Harvard University, and he has graduated from Harvard Law School. He has also a master's and a PhD in law from Harvard Law School, and he also serves as on the United Nations Committee on Migrant Workers as an independent expert. Ermal works in areas of law and economic development, public asset management, migration, trade policy, and institutional capacity building. And he has worked not only in Sri Lanka, but in a number of other countries such as Albania, Jordan, Nepal, and Thailand. So thank you very much, Ermal, for accepting our invitation to come and speak to us on this very important topic, a problem that has plagued Sri Lanka for many years, and a major public demand of the people to really find ways to tackle corruption and also to penalize and punish people who have engaged in fraud and corruption. But unfortunately, this public cry has fallen on deaf ears of many successive governments. But it is also a very important problem to address, because corruption is one factor that contributed to the current crisis. And even the IMF program we recently entered into has rightly identified addressing corruption as an important factor to consider to put Sri Lanka on a sustainable growth path. So Ermal, I had the privilege of briefly glancing through your presentation, and it looked very interesting, and I'm looking forward to your presentation. Over to you, Ermal.
Many thanks, Subhashini. First of all, I really appreciate and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to present at Verite, and especially thankful to you for creating this opportunity. As you mentioned, I have very fond memories of working in Sri Lanka. I worked there from early 2016 all the way through end of 2018, and Sri Lanka occupies a dear and special place in my heart. So I'm very delighted to have this opportunity where we can discuss together about corruption. And also thank the participants for making time to be part of this event today. So just a few words about where I come from in terms of corruption, and then what we'll cover today. So I've been teaching corruption for about 10 years or so, and have worked in the field for more than 15. And so during the course of this engagement on corruption, I teach this annual seminar course on corruption, and I've done a lot of policy research on it as well. I can theorize a lot about corruption, But to this day, if you ask me what is the remedy to corruption for any place, that I'll be amazed to actually to say what that solution will be. So it's a very so that goes to say that there's no shortage of solutions out there, but the problem is not finding a solution, but it's more finding the right solution for the right context where one is at. So in today's talk, I would like to cover various ways of thinking about corruption. So when we think about corruption, like what do we actually have in our minds, and then think a little bit more about corruption as a form of political pathology, and then also discuss remedies or fixes to corruption. So I've prepared a presentation that will help us walk through various ideas and ways of thinking about corruption. And I'll appreciate very much the engagement, your engagement, also the engagement of participants, so that we can deliberate a little bit more and then figure out new ways of thinking about corruption, but also the remedies to corruption. So allow me to share my screen, and then we'll walk through the slides, and then have an opportunity at the end to discuss.
So while Ermal is sharing the presentation, I forgot to tell the participants, feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box at any time during the presentation, and during the Q&A session, if you want to ask a question, feel free to raise your hand. We will unmute you so you can even verbally ask your questions. Thank you. Over to you, Ermal.
Thank you, appreciate it. So when we think of corruption, so corruption often seems like a plague, that it's always there, and no matter where you throw your eyes at, you always find some elements of corruption. And to give you some perspective, when I first started getting involved in this area, so like teaching it, so about 10 years ago, I remember very clearly that I did a Google search on corruption. And then, so 10 years ago, so that's in 2013, there were about 150 million hits on Google search on corruption. If you try the same thing today, and I dare you, I don't dare you, but I ask you to do that, but maybe not during the talk, but afterwards, to Google corruption, just the name corruption, you'll find more than 700 million hits. So a tremendous number of viewers and a large amount of interest in this topic. And it's a topic that spans geographies. It's a topic that spans timelines. And this is something which is very intriguing. And so when I teach the course, I teach at Denver, and every time I fly there, and I take usually an Uber or taxi from Denver airport to the school, people ask, like, what do I do? Why do I come there? And then I tell usually them that I'm there to teach a course. And they ask, what kind of course do you teach? And I tell them I teach a course on corruption. And every single time, people will turn around and say, corruption, let me tell you about corruption. And everybody has a story about corruption. And that illustrates why this topic is so salient, right? Everyone has a story about it. So when we think of corruption, we think that, as I mentioned earlier, corruption is not just located in one particular place. It crosses over geographies. It crosses over other privileges, such as developing versus developed societies. It crosses over timelines as well. We find corruption essentially everywhere. Though one of the questions that results is what kind of form? What kind of corruption do we encounter, and what are the responses to corruption? Right. But we have corruption essentially, as you can see in these headlines that I collected from various newsletters, journals. There's all sorts of political corruption, all sorts of actors, whether in the public side or private side, whether international organizations or not, whether it's developing countries or developed countries, war zones or not. We see that there's there's a universal aspect to corruption, which is both troubling, but also in a way gives us some pause to consider, like how to think about it and how to address it. So what we'll cover today is that I'll discuss a little bit more about this idea of corruption as part of a human condition, and then delve into the idea of corruption as political pathology, and in particular ways how corruption manifests itself during times of transition or upheavals. And then we'll conclude with a discussion on fixes to corruption and what has seemed to work and what hasn't worked well. And then at the end, I would like very much to have the opportunity to discuss with you about your ideas and your conceptions, questions you have, suggestions, and comments. So when we think of corruption as part of the human condition, one way to do that is to look into corruption across time and space. So corruption in antiquity, corruption in early modernity, and corruption in modern and contemporary times. When we think of corruption, often corruption is thought to be a form of deviation, coercion, degradation of virtue, political pathology, but also as part of the very fabric that defines social and political relations. Corruption is also a theme which is very much captured in arts and also in literature. So the idea here where the virtue and the vice as part of the rulership, but also the culture of corruption, right? So to what extent a culture, a given culture, foments corruption or harbors corruption. So when we look into corruption in antiquity, we'd be surprised to see some of the common themes that, some themes which are common to our contemporary societies as well. So we see that also in antiquity, there were bribing of juries. So that is the part of the judiciary or the justice system, stealing of public funds, but also using corruption as a political tool against opponents or against rivals. So this is one side of the equation. The other one pertains to the idea that corruption is often seen as a moral phenomenon. And here the idea is that a just society ought to foster virtue. And it's up to the guardians of the society, so the institutions, the rulers, and the ruling classes, to bolster those virtues. And so there is a particular association here, especially during antiquity, between, or thinking of corruption in moral and political terms. So when it comes to the moral terms, often corruption is seen as a degradation of virtues. And I'll stop to explain a little bit more here. So one of the questions that I often ask every time I teach corruption is, what do people think about corruption? So when they hear the word corruption, what comes to their mind? And this is very much a question that I would like to pose to the participants of today's event as well. So when you hear the term corruption, what do you have in mind? Like, so what comes to your mind? What do you think about it? And more often than not, corruption is not just seen as a bribe or as a way to abuse a given position for private gains, which is the standard definition of corruption that we encounter these days. But corruption is seen as fundamentally a form of degradation of virtue, degradation of expectations, degradation or erosion of trust in any authority, not only in public authorities, but also private authorities. And this is an interesting line to have in mind. So when we often think of corruption, people tend to associate corruption only with public authorities, but actually corruption is a phenomenon that resides very much, and sometimes it's more embedded in the private sector as well. And so that goes to say again, so when we think about where to localize corruption, we see that there's not just one particular place where we can locate corruption, right? But corruption is also embedded very much in art. So there's a lot of art out there that tries to embody the bad forms of governance, as well as there's art out there that embodies the good sides of governance, right? So law and order and peace and seemingly an orderly society. But there is also corruption embodied a lot in literature. So in particular, I would like to draw attention to this novel by a Tunisian author, Ben Jaloun, that talks about corruption and the way how a society which is being plagued by corruption fosters and reproduces, recycles corruption. And the main question there is what to do in a context where everyone is corrupt. So should one also be corrupt, or should one try to like refrain from it and do something different? So this is easier said than done, but that's very much the moral of the story that this novel or an author have tried to capture and dramatize, of course. So, so one of the fundamental questions that also is of use for political scientists, economists, lawyers, sociologists, and also practitioners, policymakers, is what to do in a context where corruption is endemic in a society, how to reverse the tide. And we'll be talking a bit more about these remedies later on as well, but this is one of the questions that I would like you guys to have in mind. But having said that, what is also interesting when we think about corruption as part of the human nature is that there's been a lot of moves from antiquity and onwards constantly towards addressing corruption. So when we think about the ways how societies have evolved, we see that in general, of course, there are different practices and paths out there, but we see that corruption often, in particular political corruption, was often embedded in executives or in people with executive power, which were unrestrained. And often the probability of corruption there was higher. And so the solution to that problem was seen in the form of representative institutions like legislatures. So this is the one stage of corruption. So identifying where corruption is located at and then coming up with a response. So this is one stage. But then it turns out that also these new institutions, which were created to correct corruption, also have the tendency to become corrupt, right? So more often than not, we've seen how legislatures also become corrupt. And so the solution to that was to expand the franchise and have more elections, so that it's harder for entrenched and embedded interests to persist over time. But also this is what we can call a second stage of the evolution of corruption. So from moving from one place to the next. And then the third part was more about, okay, so if there are more elections and if the franchise gets expanded, then where do we next see the corruption? And it turns out that we see corruption more in the electoral processes, and the remedy to those was to adopt and enforce campaign finance regulations, but also to enact and create a central bureaucracy, which will be a check against political moves. The main question as we think about this process of evolution of corruption is to think about how much time it takes to move from one stage to another. And this is an important question, because it's not enough because it's one, so usually, at least from a historical perspective, it's taken about 100 years to move from one stage to another. And maybe a little bit less when we're moving from, say, stage 2 to stage 3, and then from post stage 3. But still, it's a significant amount of time, and usually people are impatient, and it's hard to make a feasible argument and tell society that, look, so corruption will be fixed in 100 years if you do X and Y. So probably that won't fly. But it's a question. So how much time does it take to correct corruption? And is it possible, is it feasible that we can eradicate corruption or reduce it in a relatively short amount of time? And then the next question, which I would like you to remember, is, how do you set up these autocorrective mechanisms, right? So we see that moving from identifying corruption and moving from one stage to the next has required the adaptation of some the creation and adaptation of some corrective mechanism. And so the question is, okay, so how do we create these autocorrective mechanisms to address corruption? And then when we think about corruption as political pathology, then there are, in particular, like 3 ways of thinking about that. So one is a perspective that often historians, but also sociologists think about corruption. So Huntington has a famous saying that says that modernity breeds corruption. And this is a powerful assertion. Modernity breeds corruption. What that means is that corruption is an outcome of changes in society, big structural transformative changes, where old norms clash with new norms, where new elites clash with old elites, where governments have more power and more authority. And so those conditions generate corruption. So that's what Huntington, with his powerful assertion, means when he says that modernity breeds corruption. So in a way, it's a very sobering statement, but also sometimes it can be taken as a fatalistic statement as well, as if the corruption is inevitable, which it's not and should not be the case. And we'll return to this point in a bit as well. And then there's a second perspective here that talks about institutions which are thought to be or to create the moral basis of a given society. And here we can discuss whether, what kind of institutions harbor the potential to tolerate or create more corruption, democracies versus non-democracies, abundance of funds. But also we can think about corruption as a cultural outcome, right? Or as an outcome of particular cultures. So there's some scholarship associated with this way of thinking as well. So in some ways, this particular way of thinking asks the question, or rests on this question whether culture determines one's behavior. And this is very interesting as well for us to think about. So what is interesting here when we think about corruption as political pathology is that we can think about corruption, as Huntington says, that in a way it is to be expected when society faces transformative changes, and where these new norms that emerge as part of as a process of transition clash with older ones, where the creation of new elites leads to conflict between them and the old elite, and where, as a historical fact, governments have accumulated more power. What is also sobering in Huntington's perspective is that sometimes the drive in this particular context is to be very aggressive and ambitious about fighting corruption and to enact like broad, sweeping anti-corruption reforms. And what Huntington advises us here is that sometimes enacting this broad anti-corruption reforms and being very aggressive on corruption in this particular time also backfires. Right? So I would like, whenever I teach corruption, I like to find symbols or paintings or other forms to illustrate. So the painting that you see in this slide is about Hercules fighting Hydra, right? So the hero fighting a monster. And regardless of what happens in the myth, the legend of Hydra is that it creates more heads. So no matter how many heads you cut, there are new ones. And corruption, or the way how I think about corruption is very much along the same lines as well. So it's true that being aggressive on corruption, and if you have the right institutional frameworks and capacities, first of all, can lead to positive results, but also it may not lead to. So we'll discuss that a little bit later as to like what conditions or what does it take to be successful in the fight against corruption. But also what is interesting here about corruption, and again, within this larger theme of corruption and change, is about the idea that corruption tends to be more prevalent or to emerge more strongly in times of crisis, such as natural disasters, wars, or other types of economic and political turmoil. And the reason for that is that during those crises, those times, the government spends more or has more resources to use. But also during those times, because the focus is elsewhere, there's not that much control and oversight on the government. And so that combination tends to be fatal when it comes to corruption. And I have a couple of slides later on to illustrate what I mean by this. But also it is a fact, actually, and it has been researched that political contestation tends to be lower, or at least of lower intensity, whenever there are more resources to distribute. And this is somewhat of an interesting paradox here, or maybe not paradox, maybe too strong of a word, but a phenomenon, interesting phenomenon, that on the one hand, if there's a lot of resources to distribute, then one would think that the probability of corruption there is higher, especially if there's no adequate oversight and control, say by media or other institutions as part of the larger check and balances systems that the governments tend to have. But also we know it that from empirical research and practice that whenever there are large resources to be shared, the political contestation, at least in democracies, tends to be of lower intensity, right? And that poses an interesting question here because we have two opposing drives, and the main question is, okay, so how do we think about it, and how do we break that cycle? Right. But this is something that I would like to draw your attention to. So on the one hand, if you have more money to distribute, you and your political opponents will contest or fight less, but also the probability of somebody becoming corrupt if there are no check and balance mechanisms is high. So this is an interesting equation to think about. And in particular here, when it comes to how much money is thrown into society, so in the last 20 years, for instance, Afghanistan has received a lot of donor money, foreign aid. And so whenever there was a problem, money was thrown to it. And this particular graph here looks into the way how Afghanis perceived corruption. So if you look over the years, there's a clear trend of citizens understand or like perceiving their society to be more corrupt every year after year. And so in a way, this particular graph also validates what I mentioned earlier, that if you have more resources and if you distribute them, especially in times of crisis, without adequate check and balances, then that leads to corruption. And it's another question of whether this particular way of doing business also led to lower conflict, which is not, because Afghanistan had a civil war essentially for the last 20 years. So there's something to be said about this idea that how much money can buy away problems. But also, what is interesting, on the other hand, is to think of corruption as in connection with security, political stability, and stability, but also connecting corruption with justice and good governance. So, and there's a lot of scholarship on both these concepts here, or correlations here. In particular, Sarah Chase discusses this a lot in her work. So when talking about Afghanistan, Chase talks a lot about the way how corruption actually and led to greater political instability And that political stability and insecurity were closely associated with bad governance, right? So with corruptive practices. And so in a way, the moral of the story there is that if you want to have a just society, and as Adam Smith used to say, that you can have a poor society, but if society isn't just, then the chances of that society prevailing are low. And so if the focus is to think of or to create and maintain a just society or a good society, well governed, then corruption is at the core, or addressing corruption is at the core of this of that effort. But also, there's some more interesting scholarship here from Sarah Chase when it comes to thinking about corruption, right? So often people think of corruption as individual acts, but what researchers find is that corruption is more useful to think of corruption as part of a larger problem, as part of a larger networks and politics and power, where public offices are combined with private sector opportunities, and also, unfortunately, with criminal elements as well. And this is part of the story, or part of the problem that they see, that corruption is rarely an individual act done in isolation from the rest of the system. So of course, there are instances like that, but also it is useful to think of corruption also as a question of how networks of power are constructed and maintained over time. And what is interesting here is that if we think of corruption as part of a larger network problem, then we also find that corruption is rarely a national problem. It is more often than not, a transnational problem. And that is also a reason why there is a lot of effort in creating a paradigm on anti-corruption and good governance, but also in creating instruments in the form of conventions and other international agreements on corruption. So that there's more international and transnational cooperation, collaboration in the area of anti-corruption efforts. So how is corruption fixed in the sense? So there are particular ways to think of this, right? So starting from softer means to more aggressive ones. So when we think about how do you fix corruption, then often what we see this day in practice is that most of the organizations adopt codes of good conduct, but also states enact and enforce statutes that criminalize corruption. And also part of the paradigm has been to create anti-corruption authorities. So how do these three different instruments relate to one another, and how do they work with one another, right? So when we think, so I'll go back here very briefly. When we think about the codes of good conduct, what they usually do is that they create some norms in organizations about what is accepted and what is not. And then it is up to these organizations to enforce them. So compared to criminal statutes on corruption, they are of somewhat lesser force. So that is why I meant earlier that when we think about corruption fixes, we start from softer means towards harsher means. But the codes of good conduct are one type of instrument that has been quite prevalent in the last 15, 20 years in the efforts against corruption, taken at an organizational level. And it's very difficult to find these days organizations without some sort of code of good conduct or code of ethics or code of good governance. So the names can be are used interchangeably. And then there is corruption as part of criminal statutes. And then the problem here, when we think about criminalizing corruption, is what kind of definition do we use to do that? So the contemporary definition of corruption, that the corruption is the abuse of public office for private gain, poses several conceptual difficulties here. So one to start with is that the definition is widely seen as being too narrow, as to preclude other forms of corruption here. So that is one. Second is that when we try to define, okay, so what does this definition means? We see that it rests upon three concepts here. So it rests upon the concept of private gain, and then we need to define what that private gain is. We also need to define what the public office is and who is captured as part of this definition. So it's very easy to point out the heads of organizations, for instance, or elected politicians to occupy public offices, but what does it say about technocrats? And then the third one is defining what is abuse or what constitutes abuse. And how do we do that? Do we use legal norms to define what abuse is? Do we use public perception? Do you use polls? Do you use culture as a way of defining what is understood to be an abusive act? Right. So these are all questions that that anyone who enforces corruption need to think about before actually applying it. In addition, what is interesting here when it comes to anti-corruption fixes is that when it comes to enforcing anti-corruption statutes, usually there are three ways or like three checks or criteria to use when doing so. One is to prove, in a way, that there is some quid pro quo. So, in other words, that there is a promise in exchange for an act. And that act needs to be an official act. So this is also part of the weakness of anti-corruption statutes, that it's very difficult to prove corruption. It's very difficult to measure corruption as a general matter, because usually people don't like to talk about what they've done illegally. But also for prosecutors, investigators, and the public, is very difficult to actually enforce these statutes. And then there's also a third element here, that if you are too aggressive on anti-corruption, then you end up using the statutes as an axe versus using the statutes as surgeons use, as scalpels. So this is another dichotomy or distinction that I'd like to draw here. And if there are questions about this, I'll be more than happy to discuss them later on. But what I meant to say over these two slides is that even if corruption is criminalized in statutes, it is very difficult to actually enforce the statutes, assuming that there is capacity to enforce them. And the chance of doing something wrong in enforcing the statutes is high. It's not low. And so the question is how effective these statutes at the end of the day are, and do they really address the problem? Right. So one way of thinking about it is that in a society where corruption is endemic, or as Huntington said, that where modernity breeds corruption, how do you enforce, how do you apply anti-corruption statutes? Do you use them as an axe, or do you use them as a scalpel? And there are various ways of thinking about statutes. So apart from statutes that are part of a criminal law and deal with like bribery or grand corruption or petty corruption, there are also other elements here. In particular, some countries led by US in the mid 70s, and then other countries part of the OECD in the late 70s and onwards have enacted statutes that address corruption done in the pursuit of business elsewhere. So not only they pursue corruption domestically, but also they pursue corruptive practices done in the pursuit of a business abroad. And so one of these instruments is the FCPA, or the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So there's a ton of information about that, research, practice, policies. Unfortunately, I won't have the time to delve too much into that, but just to briefly cover it and to illustrate that in addition to having fixes which apply domestically, some states have also created instruments to apply internationally is that with FCPA in particular, US was very much concerned with the image of US businesses abroad, was very much concerned with the confidence in financial integrity and the efficient functioning of the markets. And then also motivated by these ideas that if there's corruption, then there's a number of negative spillover effects. So in particular, creating an unfair level playing field, creating substandard products, leading to market instability. And so in order to address these outcomes, one instrument to use was to investigate whether businesses were engaged in pursuit, were engaged in corruptive practices in the pursuit of business advantages abroad. So this is like what the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act does. So it covers anti-bribery provisions, but also more interestingly, it goes beyond that, because also what is interesting here is that accounting practices also are part, or in a way are used to launder bribery practices and outcomes. And also, so what is interesting here, another interesting thing about FCPA is that when we look at its reach, then we see that it covers foreign officials, it covers foreign political parties or officials, it covers persons that have knowledge, it covers persons that use commerce means which are located in a particular setting. So in this particular case, in the US, it covers also public international organizations. So these are all targets of investigations in the form that they, that the statute is unable to persecute foreign officials, but it looks into whether businesses had connections with these foreign officials. Therefore, the focus is on penalizing businesses and individuals within businesses when conducting transactions with this set of individuals or organizations or groups. Right? So another thing to illustrate these larger points is that if we look into the top cases or the top investigated cases, also adjudicated cases, we see that the cases actually include both US companies, but also foreign companies. And not only small companies, but big ones, Siemens in Germany, for instance, Goldman Sachs, Société Générale in France, Kellogg Brown as well, defense companies. So there's a wide spread of the way how this particular legislation and instrument is used to tackle corruption. And if we look into the way how the statute is enforced, then we see how the number of enforcements has varied from year to year, with some years particularly standing out, in particular 2016, 2019, and then 2020 and onwards coincide also with the COVID. So there's less or fewer transactions here to report. Sanctions are of tremendous importance here. So you can see how seriously the authorities take anti-corruption efforts if you look into the amount of sanctions imposed on companies. So the numbers are in the billions here. So in 2016, the total number of sanctions equaled $6.1 billion. And in 2020, it was a similar story. And then due to COVID in 2021 and 2022, the sanctions are more modest in scale or in comparison to the previous years. And also the map of where these companies and venues where the companies did their activities are located is of interest as well. So Latin America, China, Russia, right? So these are all interesting figures that give us some more information about when we think of what is the geography of corruption and what are the individuals or the organizations involved in this corruption endeavors. And then lastly here, I'll focus my last part of this talk on anti-corruption authorities and a few words about them, and then we'll stop for discussion. So over the years, and by over the years, I mean the last 20 years or so, anti-corruption authorities have proliferated around the world. So there's been this great paradigm on putting good governance as nexus to development. And as a result of that, part of the problem has been that by focusing on corruption as the exclusive evil for all ills of a society that has had, that has displaced from the radar other considerations or other problems that the societies had. So in other words, often policymakers, donors have seen anti-corruption efforts as a panacea for addressing all ills in a society. And that has been part of our problem. Creating these anti-corruption authorities has been one way of enforcing, or one way of materializing that paradigm. So on the one hand, we see a proliferation of these anti-corruption authorities. However, their track record is not too compelling. Often they've been established as a result of pressures from external factors. And in the instances where these anti-corruption authorities have been effective is that they've been effective when they've been embedded in governance structures that have worked in concert with each other rather than as sole instruments to address corruption. So there are in particular two successful cases whenever we think of anti-corruption efforts. So one is in Hong Kong and the other was in Singapore. And the mandate of these anti-corruption authorities enacted in both places was very broad. So it dealt with investigations, it dealt with prevention and education. So in a way, a holistic effort at tackling corruption. But then there are also other ways of structuring these anti-corruption authorities, adopting them with more narrow mandates or mixed ones, right? So there's not one particular type of anti-corruption authorities that have been established around the world. Rather, there are different models here. Some other elements here which are worth noting is that even when anti-corruption authorities are attributed with broad powers, they rarely work alone in a given field. Rather, they work better when they are embedded in a system of governance where different actors work in concert with each other to address corruption. So what has been some of the conditions here for the successful or effective function of these corruptions? So definitely domestic support, definitely political will across the political spectrum, understanding corruption in context, pragmatism in goals and objectives, independence, resources, as well as coordination among different agencies, what we mentioned earlier by having various state agencies or government units work in concert with each other, as well as oversight and accountability. At the end of the day, you want these institutions which have these broad powers to also be accountable. And also embedded in international or transnational networks. Because as we said earlier, corruption has a very strong transnational component or dimension to it. So it's very difficult to effectively address corruption by focusing solely within one's jurisdiction. And then what has been some of the adverse factors in when it comes to the effectiveness of anti-corruption efforts, in particular the function of anti-corruption authorities, is that in societies where corruption is endemic, the anti-corruption efforts have more limited impact. And this goes very much in line with what we mentioned earlier about the idea that corruption is often thought as an outcome of transition, modernity, but also as an outcome of the state not having capacities to deliver on the goods and services that it promises to its citizens. But also we see it more specifically in those cases where there's been a lack of political will or institutional independence, where there's been premature or partisan efforts in enforcing corruption, where there's been a lack of coordination, where resources have been very much contested, and where there hasn't been enough independence or financial independence for these authorities, and where officials have also enjoyed broad immunity, right? So the moral of the story here is that just by the fact of establishing a particular anti-corruption authority, one should not expect that the results will be positive. So more goes to what can make an institution effective, especially in a context where corruption is endemic. And then I'll close with this particular question to you, and then we'll open up the floor for questions and discussions. Is that as one of my mentors and boss tells, I usually ask, is that if you were the emperor of the galaxy, what would you do to address this situation? So I'll stop here, and very much looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you.